Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Lykke Li, titled I Never Learned. Now, I've talked before about my general aversion to cutesy, small-minded indie pop, especially the type that plays close to conventional middle-brow instrumentation and plays the twee element up to 11. But at the same time, it's a genre that also has other facets, and subverting those expectations can often be just as rewarding. Now, I've talked before about St. Vincent, who undercut her classically inspired instrumentation on her earlier albums with subversive lyrics, and now with experimental edge. But she's not the only one who has tackled this particular playing field. Now this takes us to Lykke Li, an artist who I originally expected to dislike a whole lot more than I do, especially off of that first album, Youth Novels. It was a minimalist, underwritten exploration of young, immature emotion, all delivered through Lykke Li's high, girlish vocals, and yet, I'll admit it, it worked for me. Lykke Li had a phenomenal grasp of melody, a great grip on her atmosphere thanks to stellar production, and the balance that she held between saccharine sweetness and unnerving wisdom for her age, it was genuinely impressive. And in a natural step forward, her second album, Wounded Rhymes, improved every single element, deepening and expanding the soundscapes while bringing forward a much more assertive presence behind the microphone and managing to clean up some of the clumsier songwriting. It was definitely a very solid record that showed that Lykke Li was a force in indie pop to be reckoned with, and honestly, I was psyched for her newest album, I Never Learned, coming out this year. Not just for the album, but for the potential mainstream breakthrough that it could represent. After all, she was only getting better, and if there was a time when minimalist, melody-driven indie pop could have a crack at the mainstream thanks to the success of acts like Lorde, it'd be now. And as great as I Follow Rivers was, and make no mistake, that song is amazing. It came out in 2011. The charts were still locked in the club boom, and they weren't ready for Lykke Li yet. So I picked up her newest album and I gave it a couple of listens. Is this the smash hit for which we've been waiting? Honestly, it's pretty damn close, because I Never Learned by Lykke Li is a great album. That might be her most focused, cohesive, and powerful work to date. And while I'm not quite sure it approaches the upper echelons of my favorite records of the year, it's pretty damn close, and definitely gets a recommendation from me here today. Now, the first thing that you should all understand about this album is that it really does function as a companion piece of her first two records, as Lykke Li has described them somewhat as a trilogy discussing similar themes. And honestly, it completely makes sense. Youth Novels was simultaneously immature and too wise for its age, and Wounded Rhymes used the catalyst of heartbreak to bring a little bit more active maturity to the proceedings. But it's I Never Learned that shows Lykke Li has finally grown up. The cuter elements of her vocals have been completely excised to embrace the richer, lower range in her voice, and coupled with the expansive production that lets her voice echo and boom across the track, it places her both in a position of sweeping power and lonely vulnerability simultaneously. If I were to quibble somewhat of the vocal production, I feel that the lo-fi pickup on the microphone on Love Me Like I'm Not Made of Stone is a little bit misplaced to emphasize intimacy. I get why it's there, but it doesn't quite feel cohesive with the rest of the track. But honestly, that's a minor gripe, and the song still manages to work with it. But you know what? It's not just the vocal production that emphasizes that larger sound. The instrumentation and production do a solid job of that all on their own. The melody lines are there as always, and they're memorable and they're effective, mostly relying on Li's vocals, but still occupying visible presence in a mix that could have easily swallowed them in the reverb. In fact, if you want to point to a record that shows how to use reverb right in the indie scene, it would be I Never Learned by Lykke Li. The keyboard lines are all solid and beautifully textured. The strings are well balanced, the backing vocals are perfectly harmonized, and you know what? Without hyperbole, this might be some of the best percussion production I've heard thus far this year. The booming tremor, the bass drum, the cracks of the snare on Gunshot, and all of it feels real and immediate and cohesive. This is most courtesy of Greg Kurstin, who brings all the chops that he brought to Adele's album 21 to the table, and man, it really does show in the best possible way here. If I do have a small issue with the production though, it's in the guitars. While I did like some of the more acoustic leaning sides on the title track that felt burnished and rich, I wasn't the biggest fan of the guitar tonal choice on Silverline, which combined with the simplistic melody lines and progression made it one of the weaker tracks on the album, at least for me. But you know what? even that track is still solid on its own, mostly thanks to lyrics and themes. As I said, this is the record where Lykke Li finally grows up, and the most important part of all that is that her framing has grown up too. She's always been very effective in conveying vulnerability to gain her sympathy through her music and her tone, but here her framing adds complexity to that vulnerability, with acknowledgments that sometimes the failures in her relationships have been her own fault. There's a harshness to the honesty on this record that is both refreshing and, I gotta admit, a little heartbreaking. And since Lykke Li is that good of a performer, you can feel real sympathy for her on songs like No Rest for the Wicked and Gunshot, two songs that very, very plainly paint her as the real problem in complicated relationships. Take songs like Just Like a Dream, a song where she knows the relationship is doomed and she's willing to leave and set it all behind, but deep down she still wants that one last night together and for that relationship to mean something to the guy in the end. And then he takes a song like Never Gonna Love Again and confronts her own fears of intimacy and saying how if she keeps running from relationships and heartbreak, she will never love again, quite literally. And really, it's the humanity of this that lends this album a whole other level of real weight, which comes forth best in the final two tracks. Heart of Steel is a plea for that vulnerability and a pledge not to be bitter, even when she's alone, accepting her own frailties and humanity, even though she knows it'll likely end up hurting her in the end. And the album ends with Sleeping Alone, a heartbreaking song how she's lonely and she doesn't want to get used to being on her own. But you know what? She'll accept it and hold on to the hope that somehow she'll end up finding love in the end. This is how you pull off a satisfying emotional arc, songwriters, and the fact this album nails it so effectively in less than 40 minutes. This is a short album. That's incredible. Guys, I'm not normally one to be part of the hype machine. If I think an album sucks, I'll tell it to you regardless of critical opinions. And if I love an album that everyone else can't stand, I'll stand behind that too. But this time, for once, most critics and I are on the exact same page and we agree. Lykke Li's I Never Learned is extremely good and one of the best indie pop albums you will hear this year. It's a strong 8 out of 10 from me and a high recommendation, especially as a thoughtful, mature, and genuinely heartfelt breakup album. And Lykke Li, if by some miraculous, strange coincidence you manage to see this review, convince your label to push Gunshot as a single to mainstream radio, because not only is this the perfect time and it will smash, it's also likely going to be one of my favorite songs of the year, and I'd love to see it get the acclaim it deserves. Folks, I Follow Rivers, that was the opening shot. The album I Never Learned, this is the full cavalry. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, you've been watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.